On Saturday, the President of the United States threatened to obliterate Iran's power grid. On Monday morning, he announced a 5-day pause. In the span of 48 hours, the world swung from the edge of a catastrophic energy war to the faintest glimmer of diplomacy, and global markets responded with one of the most violent price swings in modern history. Brent crude plunged more than 13% in minutes. The Dow surged over 1,000 points before the opening bell. And yet, the country on the other side of this supposed negotiation, Iran, flatly denied that any talks had taken place at all. This is the story of a 5-day window that could either become the off-ramp from the worst energy crisis since the 1970s, or merely the calm before a far more devastating storm. On Monday, March 23, 2026, United States President Donald Trump announced on his Truth Social platform that he was ordering the military to postpone all strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for 5 days. According to Trump, the decision followed 2 days of what he described as very good and productive conversations with Iran regarding what he called a complete and total resolution of hostilities in the Middle East. The announcement came just hours before the expiration of a 48-hour ultimatum Trump himself had issued on Saturday, threatening to obliterate Iran's power plants unless Tehran reopened the Strait of Hormuz to all shipping. Trump later told reporters at a Florida airport that his son-in-law Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff had participated in talks on Sunday evening with a top person in Iran, though not the new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. Iran, however, immediately and categorically denied that any negotiations were taking place. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf called the claim fake news designed to manipulate financial and oil markets. An unnamed senior security official quoted by the Revolutionary Guard-affiliated Fars news agency stated there had been no talks, direct or indirect. According to Iranian state media, Trump had simply backed down following what they described as Iran's firm warning that it would retaliate against energy infrastructure across the entire region if its own power grid were attacked. The contradictory narratives left the world parsing a familiar question in the Trump era. Was this a genuine diplomatic opening, a market-calming gesture, or both simultaneously? According to Axios, citing a senior official from a mediating country, Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey had been passing messages between the two sides on Sunday, with efforts underway to arrange a call between Ghalibaf and Trump's team. If that call materializes, it could determine whether an in-person meeting takes place, possibly in Islamabad. The 5-day pause cannot be understood without the chain of events that brought the Middle East to this point. The current conflict began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes on Iran, an operation the Pentagon dubbed Epic Fury. The strikes targeted military installations, nuclear sites, and the Iranian leadership itself. In the opening salvo, Israeli precision munitions struck the compound of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in Tehran. After initial denial by Iranian state media, his death was confirmed on March 1st, ending nearly 37 years of rule. The assassination of Khamenei was not an isolated event but the culmination of an escalatory spiral stretching back years. In 2024, Iran and Israel exchanged direct missile strikes for the first time. In June 2025, Israel and the United States conducted the 12-day war against Iran, which killed over 1,000 people, according to the human rights group Hrana, and decimated much of Iran's senior military leadership. In January 2026, Iranian security forces killed thousands of protesters in what became the largest demonstrations since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Trump responded by threatening military action and launching the largest American military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The February 28 strikes triggered an immediate and furious Iranian retaliation. Tehran launched hundreds of missiles and drones at Israel, at American military bases across the Gulf, and at targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. On March 4th, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. The waterway, barely 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries roughly 20% of the world's oil and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas. Its closure set off a global energy crisis that the International Energy Agency has called the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. On March 9th, Iran's Assembly of Experts appointed Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the slain leader, as the new supreme leader, a move that cemented the hardline establishment's grip on power and signaled defiance toward Washington and Tel Aviv. Trump called the appointment unacceptable, and Israel threatened to target any successor. The war, now in its fourth week, has killed more than 2,000 people across the region, according to NBC News. including over 1,500 in Iran, at least 1,000 in Lebanon where conflict with Hezbollah has reignited, 15 in Israel, and 13 American service members. The geopolitical chessboard around this 5-day pause involves multiple actors with overlapping and conflicting interests. For the United States, the pause reflects a tension between military objectives and economic reality. The stated goal of Operation Epic Fury has been regime change in Tehran, the destruction of Iran's missile arsenal and nuclear program, and the re-establishment of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. But the war has produced severe blowback at home. According to CNN, American gasoline prices have risen for 23 consecutive days, reaching $3.96 per gallon, the highest since August 2022. An NPR PBS News Marist poll found 56% of Americans oppose the war. Wall Street has been demanding de-escalation, and Trump's pause came, as Senator Chris Murphy noted, with a message aimed squarely at calming financial markets before the end of the trading week. For Iran, the calculus is different but no less urgent. The country's military capabilities have been severely degraded, with the Henga Organization for Human Rights estimating over 5,300 military personnel killed in the first 18 days of the conflict. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not been seen or heard from publicly since the war began, and according to CBS News, the White House believes the IRGC, not the clerical leadership, is effectively running the country. Yet Iran retains its most powerful leverage, the Strait of Hormuz. By keeping the waterway closed, Tehran has inflicted economic pain far beyond its own borders, turning a military disadvantage into an asymmetric economic weapon. Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has continued strikes on Tehran even after Trump's pause announcement. According to CNN, the Israeli Defense Forces struck what they described as an IRGC headquarters and other military buildings in the Iranian capital on Monday. Netanyahu stated he had spoken with both Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance about the components of a possible agreement. For Israel, the war represents an opportunity to permanently neutralize what it considers an existential threat, and any deal must account for its security requirements. The mediating countries, Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey, each have their own stakes. Pakistan is heavily dependent on imported oil and has been forced to seek rerouted shipments from Saudi Arabia. Turkey, a NATO member, saw its airspace threatened when Iran reportedly launched a ballistic missile in its direction. And the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, are caught between their American alliance and the physical reality that Iranian missiles have struck their territory, disrupted their economies, and jeopardized their food and water supplies. The economic dimension of this crisis is staggering, and it is the principal reason financial markets responded with such ferocity to Trump's 5-day pause. According to the International Energy Agency's March report, the war has created the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. With tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz reduced to what the IEA describes as a trickle, approximately 20 million barrels per day of crude and petroleum products have been effectively removed from global markets. Gulf producers have been forced to shut in at least 10 million barrels per day of production, according to IEA data published on March 12th, simply because they cannot ship it. Oil prices tell the story in blunt numerical terms. Brent crude surged from around $65 per barrel before the war to a peak above $120 last week, according to Bloomberg, a roughly 40% increase. On Monday, following Trump's announcement, Brent plunged more than 13% at one point, briefly falling below $100 before settling around $104. Goldman Sachs raised its Brent forecast to $110 per barrel for March and April. The United States Energy Information Administration revised its 2026 Brent average to $79, up from a previous forecast of $58 just 1 month earlier. But the crisis extends far beyond oil. IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol warned on Monday that the situation is worse than the combined oil crises of 1973 and 1979, noting that it affects not only oil and gas but also petrochemicals, fertilizers, sulfur, and helium, all of which transit the strait. The region accounts for roughly 45% of the global sulfur supply and significant volumes of urea exports, critical for agriculture. The UN World Food Programme has warned that these disruptions are driving long-term increases in global food prices. In response, IEA member nations agreed on March 11th to release a record 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves, including 172 million barrels from the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But as energy strategist Naif Al-Dandeni noted in comments to Al Jazeera, 400 million barrels covers roughly 20 days of normal Hormuz traffic flows, a small bandage on a large wound if the closure persists. The European Central Bank has already postponed planned interest rate cuts and slashed its GDP growth projections, while Asian economies from Vietnam to the Philippines have implemented energy-saving measures including 4-day work weeks and work-from-home mandates. The 5-day pause has generated sharply divergent interpretations among analysts and experts. For some, the announcement marks the first genuine de-escalation signal since the war began. According to a senior Arab diplomat quoted by Axios, both sides showed readiness to begin talking on Sunday, driven by the pressure of oil prices and market instability. Chris Larkin, managing director at E-Trade from Morgan Stanley, told NBC News that the market woke up to potentially good news, though he cautioned that follow-through on any relief rally will require tangible follow-through on the geopolitical front. Others are more skeptical. Peter Sand, chief analyst at Zanetta, an ocean and air freight data firm, told CNN that shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is completely off the charts for the rest of 2026 due to the uncertainty and security situation. The physical reality is that hundreds of tankers remain idle on both sides of the strait. Insurance premiums for transit have become prohibitive, and no ceasefire announcement alone will restore commercial confidence. Goldman Sachs analysts noted that even their optimistic scenario assumes Hormuz flows remain at 5% of normal levels through at least April 10th. The contradictory narratives from Washington and Tehran add a layer of analytical complexity. If Iran truly has not engaged in direct or indirect talks, then Trump's pause may be primarily a unilateral gesture aimed at markets and domestic political pressure. If back-channel communications are underway through third-party mediators, as Axios reporting suggests, then the public denials could serve Iran's domestic interests by avoiding the appearance of capitulation while leaving space for quiet diplomacy. Brigadier General Amir Avivi of the Israel Defense and Security Forum told the Eye for Iran podcast that the trajectory of the war is rapidly weakening the Iranian regime, and that it could be a matter of weeks before conditions are ripe for an internal uprising. This view, however, represents one end of the analytical spectrum. Johns Hopkins professor Vali Nasser, an expert on Iranian politics, has argued that the selection of Mojtaba Khamenei as supreme leader actually consolidated hardline power rather than weakening it. And as one unnamed analyst told Time magazine, the new supreme leader lost his father, mother, wife, and child in the February 28th strikes. He is filled with an undying desire for revenge, and the guards know this. The reverberations of this crisis have been felt across every continent. In Asia, which receives approximately 75% of Persian Gulf oil exports and 59% of LNG, the impact has been immediate and severe. China has imposed price caps on fuel increases. Japan, which receives roughly 70% of its Middle Eastern oil via the strait, has asked refiners to release stockpiled reserves. Vietnam has urged citizens to work from home. The Philippines has shifted to a 4-day government work week, and Sri Lanka has made every Wednesday a public holiday to conserve energy. According to Chevron CEO Mike Wirth, speaking at the CERAWeek conference in Houston on Monday, Asian supply shortages cannot be undone simply by releasing strategic reserves. Europe faces its own acute vulnerability, particularly in natural gas. The continent started 2026 with gas storage at approximately 46 billion cubic meters, well below the 60 billion of 2025. The loss of Qatari LNG, which accounts for 12 to 14% of European supply and transits the strait, has pushed Dutch TTF gas benchmarks to double their pre-war levels. European industries, particularly in the chemical and steel sectors, have imposed surcharges of up to 30% to offset energy costs, according to analyses of the economic impact of the war. In the Middle East itself, the humanitarian toll extends beyond the battlefield. Gulf Cooperation Council states rely on the Strait of Hormuz for over 80% of their food imports. By mid-March, according to reporting on the economic impact, 70% of the region's food imports had been disrupted. Iran's own population, already stretched by years of sanctions and inflation, faces power shortages and supply disruptions as the conflict damages domestic infrastructure. The United States, as the world's largest oil producer, is somewhat insulated from the direct supply disruption but not from the price effects. According to AAA, American gasoline prices have jumped over $1 per gallon in the past month alone, the largest one-month increase since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The next 5 days will be among the most consequential in the Middle East since the war began. The immediate question is whether the reported back-channel contacts between Washington and Tehran, mediated through Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey, produce a tangible result. According to Axios, the mediating countries were attempting to arrange a call on Monday between Ghalibaf and Trump's envoys, which could determine whether an in-person meeting takes place, possibly in Islamabad. If that meeting materializes, it would be the most significant direct engagement between American and Iranian officials since the conflict began. Watch oil prices as the most sensitive barometer. Brent crude settling below $100 would signal growing market confidence in a diplomatic resolution. A return above $120 would indicate the opposite. Goldman Sachs expects prices to trend higher if Hormuz flows remain near current levels through April 10th. On the military front, the critical variable is whether Israeli strikes continue to escalate even during the American pause. Netanyahu has signaled support for the diplomatic track, but Israel's defense establishment has continued operations in Tehran. Any major military escalation during the 5-day window from either side could collapse the fragile opening. Finally, monitor Iran's rhetoric about the Strait of Hormuz. Any signal that Tehran is willing to discuss reopening the waterway even partially or conditionally would represent a significant shift. Conversely, Iran's Defense Council threat to mine the entire Persian Gulf if a ground invasion is attempted suggests that escalation remains very much on the table. What happened on March 23, 2026 was not peace. It was not even a ceasefire. It was a 5-day pause in a threat to strike power plants, announced by a president under pressure from the very markets his war has destabilized, denied by the very country he claims to be negotiating with, and watched by a world that has spent the past 3.5 weeks learning just how fragile the arteries of the global economy really are. The Strait of Hormuz, 34 kilometers of water between Iran and Oman, has become the fulcrum on which the price of bread in Cairo, the heating bill in Berlin, and the commute in Houston all pivot. Whether this pause becomes a doorway to diplomacy or merely an intermission in escalation will depend not on rhetoric or social media posts, but on whether the interests of all sides can find a point of convergence narrow enough to pass through. The world is watching, and the clock is ticking.